The ruins of an old Spanish mission lie just east of the San Antonio River. There, on an early March morning in 1836, one could witness both the murderous cruelty of a dictatorial tyrant and the purest courage and self-sacrifice for the cause of liberty one is apt to see this side of heaven. The name of that ruin was the Alamo. To understand why men fought here and why men died here, one has to go back a little bit in time. There was a community in the town of Gonzales that had been given a cannon to protect them from raids from Native American tribes which had attacked them in the past. And the Mexican government wanted to get the cannon back because they didn't like that to be in the hands of people who might oppose them. Well, on October 1st of 1835, a cavalry troop of 100 men rode up to Gonzales and faced 18 citizens of that town across the river. The Tejanos there basically told the troopers, "Come and take it." The next day, the Mexican soldiers found that the 18 men were now 180 men. They talked for a little bit, but eventually things came to blows and the Mexicans got the short end of it. The Texans disarmed the surviving Mexican troops and allowed them to withdraw peaceably down to San Antonio de Bexar. More and more men started converging upon Gonzales until about 400 Texians and Tejanos had gathered in force. This had been kind of the Lexington and Concord of the Texan Revolution. Now the Texans were ready to march against Mexican forces. So they advanced against San Antonio, and down there was located a force of 275 Mexican soldiers under the command of General Martin Prefecto de Cos, who was the brother-in-law of Santa Anna. And he went up against the 400 Texans, lost about 50 men, and was defeated. Of course, the Texans allowed the Mexican soldiers to withdraw in peace back into Mexico after disarming them. But Santa Anna was not about to let this insult to his dignity to go unrepaid. And so the Texans started to improve the fortifications of the Alamo, expecting at some point a counterattack. Now Sam Houston said to the forces there, "Get out of there, demolish the fort, and get out of there because it's indefensible." But other leaders suggested that this was an important road through San Antonio into the interior of Texas, and they really would prefer to have an outpost there. Well, the result was that they did stay there. About 150 men wound up at the Alamo with about 17 or 18 cannon. Santa Anna spent the winter months in a forced march, bringing his army of several thousand men up north. He lost about 500 men due to the terrible conditions that they endured, but for some reason Santa Anna thought that that was a great achievement on his part, as he styled himself as the Napoleon of the West. His army arrived at San Antonio de Bexar on February 23 of 1836. In early February, the force at the Alamo was basically split into two commands. One was a group of volunteers under the command of Jim Bowie, and the second force were Texan soldiers who were under the command of William Travis. Travis had been second in command, but the commander of the fort had gone on furlough, and now Travis was placed in command. The two fellows, Bowie and Travis, did not get along. It took Davy Crockett, the backwoodsman, hunter, and former congressman from Tennessee, to provide the lubrication between the two irritating parts. And so Travis and Bowie agreed to a joint command. In the end, it really wouldn't matter. That 150 men was not going to be able to hold back an army of over 1,800 men at the Alamo. Santa Anna opened up an artillery barrage on the next day, the 24th of February. Travis wrote the most remarkable letter in the history of Texas. And the letter goes like this: "To the people of Texas and all Americans in the world, fellow citizens and compatriots, I am besieged by 1,000 or more of the Mexicans under Santa Anna, I have sustained a continual bombardment and cannonade for 24 hours and have not lost a man. The enemy has demanded a surrender at discretion, which means they will decide whether they kill you or not. Otherwise, the garrison are to be put to the sword if the fort is taken. I have answered the demand with a cannon shot, and our flag still waves proudly from the walls. I shall never surrender or retreat. And then I call on you in the name of liberty, of patriotism, and everything dear to the American character to come to our aid with all dispatch. The enemy is receiving reinforcements daily and will no doubt increase to 3,000 or 4,000 in 4 or 5 days. If this call is neglected, I am determined to sustain myself as long as possible and die like a soldier who never forgets what is due to his own honor and that of his country. Victory or death. Signed, William Barrett Travis, Lieutenant Colonel, Commandant. P.S. The Lord is on our side. When the enemy appeared in sight, we had not 3 bushels of corn. We have since found in deserted houses 80 or 90 bushels and got into the walls 20 or 30 head of beasts. Now, written on the back of Travis's letter was a note by Albert Martin, who was the courier who brought the letter out from the Alamo to Gonzales. And he wrote, "Since the above was written, I heard a very heavy cannonade during the whole day. Think there must have been an attack made upon the Alamo. We were short of ammunition when I left. Hurry on all the men you can in haste. When I left, there was but 150 determined to do or die tomorrow. I leave for Behar, which is San Antonio, with what men I can raise at all events. Colonel Almonte is there. The troops are under the command of General Sesma." Signed, Albert Martin. The next day, Martin, leading 31 other fellows from Gonzales, made their way to the Alamo and, under the cover of darkness, on March 1st, made it into the fort, and all of them would die there. Also printed on the back of Travis's letter was a note by Smither, who was the second courier who brought the letter from Gonzales further on into Texas. And it was printed sideways on the back of the letter. "I hope that everyone will rendezvous at Gonzales as soon as possible, as the brave soldiers are suffering. Do not neglect this. Powder is very scarce and should not be delayed one moment." From this letter, you can see that Travis hoped and expected reinforcements to come, but had no indication that they were actually going to make it in time, or if they would ever arrive. But whether or not reinforcements would come to relieve the garrison at the Alamo, the men in the fort, while not courting their own deaths, were willing to die if necessary at their post. Santa Anna decided on the night of the 5th of March to attack the next morning. And so, in the darkness, he had his troops crawl within 100 yards of the fort and wait. And then, in the early morning hours before dawn, he expected the attack to begin. But somebody in the Mexican line apparently stood up prematurely and started shouting his battle cries. Bugles then blared, and men rose to the attack, and the fight was on. In the initial moments of the battle, Travis, pointing his shotgun down, killed a couple of soldiers who were below him. In the process, he took a bullet to the head and died immediately at the very beginning of the fight. Jim Bowie was delirious in bed with tuberculosis, probably dying from that, and he took no part in command and control of the forces inside the Alamo, so that in the earliest moments of the battle, command and control had vanished, and now the fight had deteriorated into an uncoordinated defense by small pockets of resistance that were eliminated one by one. The north wall and the west wall were breached, and with Mexican soldiers pouring into the central compound, the Texians and the Tejanos, they moved themselves into the barracks, and all the Mexican forces had to do was to turn the cannons against those walls and pound away, and it became a slaughter pen in there. It only took about 90 minutes for the battle, for all the men in the Alamo to be killed. There was some diaries or reports that maybe 6 or 7 men actually did survive the battle, but were captured inside the fort. Anybody who tried to run outside the fort were cut down. No one knows who exactly those 6 or 7 men were. Some say Davy Crockett was among them, but the widow of Captain Dickinson testified later on, and years later, that she had seen the body of Davy Crockett in the plaza to the left of the chapel by the long barracks. So whether or not Crockett had died right there by the long barracks, or whether he had survived the battle and been executed by Santa Anna is not particularly known, but the likelihood is that he died right by the long barracks. The order went from Santa Anna to kill the 7 men who were caught. The soldiers who had had enough of murder were very hesitant to do so, so some officers who had not participated in the battle drew their swords and hacked away at the poor fellows. It was reported by the Mexican officer that the men died bravely without disgracing themselves, despite the horror and the manner of their deaths. And that was the end of the last resistance at the Alamo. After the battle, Santa Anna arranged to gather up all of the corpses of the defenders, and he had them burned rather than buried. He did not want to leave a shrine of the graves of the men defending the Alamo as an inspiration and a focal point for further resistance. The purpose of executing all prisoners was to terrorize the people of Texas, that if you failed to surrender, that you would suffer death. And rather than terrorizing the people, it had the opposite effect upon the fighting men of Texas. They were outraged, and they were highly motivated to give back to the Mexicans what had been given to the men at the Alamo. 6 weeks later, on the 21st of April of 1836, Santa Anna's army of about 1,500 men was up against the San Jacinto River near what is now Houston, Texas. Sam Houston came up with an army of only about 800 men, half the size of the Mexican army. But the men raised the battle cry, "Remember the Alamo," and went into the Mexican army with a vengeance, and in less than 20 minutes destroyed utterly the entire Mexican army. Santa Anna fled and hid, but he was caught the next day, and in exchange for sparing his life, he agreed to the independence of Texas, and so the Texas Revolution ended by the cowardly man saving his own skin where he had murdered those who had been captured in other engagements. Why should we remember the Alamo today? Well, I think the answer is in the question itself. The men at the Alamo brought an opportunity for the army of Sam Houston to form, and their example and their sacrifice motivated these men to defeat a greatly superior force in a remarkably short period of time. Given the example of what happened at the Alamo, and then the consequent fight at San Jacinto, maybe you could answer the question to yourself. If you were faced with an oppressor attempting to deprive you of your rights, of your liberties, would you submit in order to secure safety, or would you fight? Remember the Alamo. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you liked this, please give us a thumbs up on YouTube, subscribe to our channel, and share it with your friends. Thank you for watching. God bless you.